Hi, boys and girls. I am so excited because today we are going to be starting Module 3. Module 3 is called America, Then and Now. You are going to have the chance to learn about some history, learn about life in the past, and think about how it compares to your own life today. Here is a collection of the books we will be looking at in Module 3. If you look across the top, there are 4 nonfiction or informational texts that we are going to be digging into. Take a look at the pictures on there for communication and school and home and transportation. Do those make you notice anything? I notice some very old-fashioned things happening on those covers. In Home Then and Now, I see a woman cooking on an old-fashioned stove. In School Then and Now, the children look like they are kind of sitting in an old-fashioned schoolhouse, maybe a log cabin. And in Transportation Then and Now, I certainly don't see cars like that on the road anymore. At the bottom of your screen, you see 2 other texts we're going to be reading in Module 3. Now and Ben, which will teach us all about Benjamin Franklin, and the text we're going to be reading today, which is called When I Was Young in the Mountains. So our essential question for this module is, how has life in America changed over time? Today we're going to be reading the text When I Was Young in the Mountains. It's by Cynthia Rylant and the illustrations are by Diane Good. As we're reading, you're going to consider, how was Cynthia Rylant's life different from your life? If you look at that word in the title, when indicates or tells us about a time that something happens. So as we're reading, I want you to think about this story and when it is taking place. Is this story taking place now? Or is this story taking place in the past? We're going to look for some clues that tell us when this story was taking place and looking at ways that Cynthia Rylant's life was different from yours. When I Was Young in the Mountains. When I was young in the mountains, Grandfather came home in the evening covered with the black dust of a coal mine. Only his lips were clean, and he used them to kiss the top of my head. When I was young in the mountains, Grandmother spread the table with hot cornbread, pinto beans, and fried okra. Later, in the middle of the night, she walked through the grass with me to the Johnny house and held my hand in the dark. I promised never to eat more than 1 serving of okra again. When I was young in the mountains, we walked across the cow pasture and through the woods carrying our towels. The swimming hole was dark and muddy, and we sometimes saw snakes, but we jumped in anyway. On our way home, we stopped at Mr. Crawford's for a mound of white butter. Mr. Crawford and Mrs. Crawford looked alike and always smelled of sweet milk. When I was young in the mountains, we pumped pails of water from the well at the bottom of the hill and heated the water to fill round tin tubs for our baths. Afterward, we stood in front of the old black stove, shivering and giggling, while Grandmother heated cocoa on top. When I was young in the mountains, we went to church in the schoolhouse on Sundays, and sometimes walked with the congregation through the cow pasture to the dark swimming hole for baptisms. My cousin Peter was laid back into the water, and his white shirt stuck to him, and my grandmother cried. When I was young in the mountains, we listened to frogs sing at dusk and awoke to cowbells outside our windows. Sometimes a black snake came in the yard, and my grandmother would threaten it with a hoe. If it did not leave, she used the hoe to kill it. 4 of us once draped a very long snake, dead of course, across our necks for a photograph. When I was young in the mountains, we sat on the porch swing in the evenings, and grandfather sharpened my pencils with his pocket knife. Grandmother sometimes shelled beans and sometimes braided my hair. The dogs lay around us, and the stars sparkled in the sky. A bobwhite whistled in the forest. Bob, bob, bobwhite. Boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed that story about Cynthia Ryland's life when she was young in the mountains. Now, before we begin, I ask you to consider when that story was taking place. I noticed some things in the story that gave me some clues that that story took place in the past. I noticed that they were taking their baths in metal tubs. I noticed that the grandmother was outside in the garden. I noticed that their church looked like an old building, an old wooden building, and I noticed that they were swimming in a swimming hole in the country. Maybe you noticed some of those same things as I was reading. I want you to take a look at this here. This was something in the story. And here's a photograph of that something. This is called a water pump. People used to get their water from a water pump that looks a lot like this. Now we're lucky and we can just turn on the faucet or use the water on the refrigerator. But in the past, people had to get their water outside from a water pump. Now, over here, I want you to look at these collection of images. I want you to think about, what did we see in this story? There are a lot of items here that Americans used in the past. So the point of this is to get your mind thinking about how things are really different from this story than your life now. So we're going to draw some circles around things that we saw in this story. Here's one, that water pump. Another one that I saw was a candle when the little girl had to go outside to go to the bathroom with her grandmother. I noticed that her grandmother had a candle. Another one is this old-fashioned stove. The children took their baths in front of the stove while the grandmother was making cocoa on top of the stove. Something else that I saw was a bucket. The little girl said they brought in water and they had to heat it up in the bucket. These are just a few items that I hope that you saw in the story too. And next time, we're going to spend a little more time in a story when I was young in the mountains. And we're going to look at some more ways that life was the same and life was different than yours.